The title of my lecture this evening is Pathways to Impact, the Politics of Knowledge Production and the Limits of Social Scientific Inquiry. Now, as all of you in this room will know, the quality of social scientific research is increasingly being measured by its capacity for impact. This has been driven in part by RC UK and REF imperatives. As a matter of routine, as you know, funding applications must now include pathways to impact statements and identify a set of non-academic stakeholders. And a 4-star REF impact case study has become an extremely lucrative dimension of the REF itself, comprising, as they now do, a growing and significant proportion of the research excellence grant that flows to universities. Local and central government are also exerting pressures on universities to be demonstrably engaged with their wider publics, including communities at both home and abroad. And that is part of my role within the University of Edinburgh as assistant principal, is actually to facilitate those kind of connections. And compliance with instruments such as the RC UK Concordat for engaging the public with research is likely to be an important indicator of the quality of the research environment for research purposes. Now, these multiple pressures have, of course, the potential to skew the types of research that get funded, and in particular the types of research and researcher that may be nurtured by academic managers. As social scientists have become not just the producers and consumers of social scientific knowledge, crucially they have also become the purveyors of that knowledge beyond the academy. And in that context, they too have turned, the nature of academic esteem has turned, becoming increasingly monetized. So there's a monetization of academic esteem. Taken together then, the impact agenda and its consequences for me go to the heart of a much bigger question, namely who or what are universities for? And that's why I've included Edinburgh University Tartan on that slide there. I think this goes to the heart of our very identity as institutions and our very identity as scholars, so it's important. Well, in this lecture, I'm going to reflect on the impact agenda and its implications for theory and method within social sciences, using criminology as a case study. And it's going to be structured around the 4 core questions that I've got on this slide here. So in part 1 of the paper, I'm going to ask what is the nature of the policy problem that the impact agenda might seek to solve. In part 2, what are the external political and institutional contexts of knowledge deployment and how do they shape impact pathways? And part 3, what are the lessons to be drawn from the efforts of my own research team to gain traction within the policy process? And then I'm going to offer some very final concluding reflections on the question, who or what are universities for? Now, the empirical reference for this paper, I'm sorry, this slide is slightly dense, so just listen to me. It's just really for me, this slide. So there are 2 major strands of research that I'm going to be drawing on, which actually have formed the focus of my own research career as an academic criminologist over some 22 years. So firstly, a governance project that is exploring the impact of multi-level governance on crime and its control. And secondly, an etiological project already mentioned, exploring pathways into and out of crime and their impacts on health and well-being. Now, this was formerly the Edinburgh Study of Youth Transitions and Crime, but we've had to change the title of this as the cohort has got a bit older, so they're now around about age 30. And also, as we have actually expanded the study to grow in scope to include a broader set of transitions through the life course and a set of topics linked to design and human flourishing. Now, both of these projects have involved collaborations with other scholars. I've always been a team player. I'm not a lone scholar. And I'd like to give a special tribute to the many people who've been involved with the Edinburgh study over its 19-year lifespan so far, and we're hoping to get some more money to do even more research. So I want to also pay tribute, not least to my research, I call her my research sister, and my fellow co-director, Susan McVie, who's actually here this evening. So a lot of the work that I'm going to be mentioning is actually work that I've done in collaboration with Susan. Now, the Edinburgh study is, of course, multi-method in orientation, and in recent years, it has had impact relating to youth crime and justice in Scotland and beyond. But as I will demonstrate, this has been a hard fight. And I'm going to use findings from the governance project to provide insights into the reason why the policy process often remains impervious to social scientific knowledge, even in areas of so-called evidence-based policy. Okay, so on then to the first part of the paper. What is the nature of the problem to be solved? Well, the subject area of criminology provides a very good test case for the capacity of universities to have a transformative impact in the world beyond the academy. It has to be said that criminology has not always had a high status amongst social scientists, and you know who you are out there. Its applied nature, its borrowings from sociology, anthropology, political science, and psychology, to name but a few, have meant that other social science disciplines sometimes view criminologists as jacks of all trades and masters of none. David Downs, a very eminent criminologist, memorably called criminology a rendezvous discipline, a site of methodological and theoretical crossings. And this, I think, is actually reflected in the current debates on whether criminology should be a unit of assessment in its own right, have its own ref panel in its own right in the next ref, or whether it should continue to be located variously in units of assessment related to law, sociology, or social policy. So in addressing the first of my questions, I'm going to argue that the traditional eclecticism of criminology should be a key strength in negotiating the world of research impact, but that the massive expansion of the subject area in recent years, including high demand for criminology degrees, has paradoxically introduced a degree of specialization and methodological purity into the subject area, which may undermine its capacity to have lasting impact and legacy in the policy world. The principal reason for this is that crime itself is what Rittel and Weber and also Grint would term a wicked problem, complex and contested in nature and difficult, if not impossible, to solve. Now, I know that many of you in the room will be completely familiar with the concept of wicked problems, but just to remind you, here's a typology that Grint included in one of his recent papers. Now, according to Grint, wicked problems sit across and between government departments. There are no stopping points at which the problem is solved, and solutions often become another problem. Efforts to address wicked problems require a certain form of leadership, one which, in his words, asks the right questions rather than always seeking to provide the right answers. So it's about question raising. He contrasts these with two other types of problem: the tame problem, in which there is only a limited degree of uncertainty about how to proceed. There is always an answer, and where such problems can be resolved through unilinear acts in a single institutional framework. Leadership in this context is characterized by management through process. And finally, critical problems, which arise in times of perceived crisis, where there is limited time to react, there is no uncertainty, the answer is needed now. Leadership here takes the form of command. Now, Grint's typology is useful because for me it illuminates the competing conceptions of the problem of crime that arguably have become the default position of criminal justice practitioners, politicians, and academic criminologists. There's a degree of conceptual dissonance which limits capacity for influence and understanding. Evidence shows that politicians do have a tendency to treat crime as a critical problem, one which demands immediate action and one which is solvable by command and control. By contrast, practitioners within the criminal justice system have generally treated crime as a tame problem, managing it within their own specific sites within the system according to their own cultural practices. And I'm going to come back to both of those points a little bit later in the paper. Academic research, however, continually highlights the wicked nature of the problem. Even going back to the 19th century, Durkheim was alert to the complex nature of the so-called crime problem, arguing, as you all know, that crime could not be eradicated. Indeed, it was integral to a healthy society, but it needed to be maintained at neither too high a level, otherwise society would collapse, nor at too low a level, which would indicate repression and it would lead to social stagnation. And I can just imagine giving a policy briefing to Michael Matheson, drawing on Durkheim and saying, Minister, you've got to keep the crime at the right level. So have you got your levels up at the right level? And more contemporary research, such as the Edinburgh study, has shown a very long-standing associations between crime and a variety of other problematic behaviours, contexts and outcomes, highlighting in policy terms how crime falls within the remit of housing, health, family, economic and education policy, as much as, if not more than, the criminal justice portfolio. Now, whilst policy in the UK has paid lip service to the complex nature of crime and the need to reach out to other policy areas and a range of agencies with the use of such tropes as the need for interagency liaison in the 1990s, that was the way we talked about this, partnership working in the 2000s, and co-production and co-creation today, research evidence shows that such concepts are little understood and are rarely transformative. Fundamentally, then, for academics to get a toehold in the policy process, they have to actively seek to change the mindset of politicians and practitioners, and that's extraordinarily difficult. So what then are the chances then of academics providing the necessary leadership in Grint's terms? Well, as indicated on this slide here, I think there are some challenges. Recent years have seen a fragmentation of criminology into a vast number of specialisms. In our introduction to the most recent edition of the Oxford Handbook of Criminology, Alison Liebling, Shad Maruna and I highlighted the huge number of specialist handbooks that have come onto the marketplace on topics as diverse as rural criminology, green criminology, policing, criminal justice, victims and victimology, the Handbook of Juvenile Justice, the Handbook of Youth Justice, the Handbook of Quantitative Criminology, Punishment and Society, Crime Prevention, and so on and so on. There are also a growing number of specialist journals such as Youth Justice, Quantitative Criminology, Developmental and Life Course Criminology, Crime, Media and Culture, Feminist Criminology, etc., Qualitative Criminal Justice and Criminology. There's actually a myriad of specialist journals emerging where people publish. And the danger, of course, with such specialisation, as Susan McVie and I have argued in a published paper, is that it makes criminology increasingly introspective and potentially self-referential. A recent review of the top 5 international criminology journals found that 9 of the top 10 most cited scholars were involved in developmental and life course criminology, and they were part of a close-knit group who mostly cited each other. Now, these developments pose the danger of specialisms becoming conversations only with themselves and consequently narrowing our methodological and theoretical imagination. Within criminology, theories get traction when they are parsimonious, when they are simple, when they can be described on one side of an overhead. And methodological innovations are continually seeking to have pure methodology, coherence in epistemological standpoints. So coherence and parsimony are things that are valorized as examples of excellence. But as we'll see, I think they are somewhat problematic. A further challenge to be negotiated relates to the ways in which the impact agenda has encouraged new ways of partnership working with institutions of criminal justice. Now, on one hand, there are many benefits to be gained by this kind of partnership working, and successful examples include the Scottish Institute for Policing Research, led by Nick Fife in Dundee, and the N8 Policing Research Partnership in England, being led by Adam Crawford at Leeds. However, care needs to be taken in all such relationships that academics retain critical distance, that such partnerships do not lead to an access divide in the academy between insiders and outsiders, and that the pernicious consequences of clientelism and knowledge patronage are always and everywhere to be avoided. So there's a need for a great deal of reflexivity on the part of academics who participate in those kind of partnership arrangements. And a final issue relates to the increasing pace of academic life and the rapid and reactive modes of scholarship that now characterise research portfolios. Pressures which have led within criminology, and I think also in some social science more generally, pressures have led to a proliferation of journal articles rather than research monographs. Keynote texts from the past are becoming much more rare as a consequence. So things like Cohen's work on visions of social control, David Downs' work on contrasts and tolerance, David Garland's work on culture of control, that kind of research monograph is becoming increasingly rare, and that has consequences for theoretical development. So those are the challenges I think that contemporary criminological scholarship faces in terms of providing the kind of leadership that Grint wants. And what kind of leadership does Grint want? Well, interrogation of wicked problems requires us to go back to the rendezvous, multidisciplinary characteristics of criminology as it was, to resist the level of specialism, to resist the specialist mindset, and to embrace what Grint has called clumsy rather than elegant theoretical and methodological responses. There may in fact be contradiction and paradox in the kinds of methods we might choose, contradiction and paradox and complexity in the kinds of theories that we need to evolve in order to understand wicked problems. As he said, and I quote, adopting the world of what he calls the bricoleur, or the do-it-yourself craft worker, as scholars, we need to assume that no one has the solution in isolation, he goes on, that the problem is a system, not an individual problem, and not a problem caused by or solved by a single aspect of the system, unquote. Clumsy approaches involve disruption and challenge, but also crucially, they involve slow scholarship, avoiding the fast-paced, metric-oriented dynamics of the 21st century university. So that's why this is actually a very challenging challenging agenda for criminology. So that's the problem to be solved and some of the limitations of criminological inquiry. Now on then to the second of my questions. What are the contexts of knowledge deployment and how do they shape impact pathways? Well, here I want to pick up on the points I made regarding politician and practitioner responses to the problem of crime as respectively a critical and tame issue, and take a more detailed look at the external institutional contexts and life worlds which we as academics are attempting to influence. Here I'm going to demonstrate that there is a major dissonance between what governments do, how criminal justice institutions generally behave, and their mostly damaging effects on the life chances of the young people caught up in their tutelage. And taken together, these, I think, present severe challenges for the impact agenda. I'm going to take each in turn. Okay. So, what are called statecraft. A review of youth justice policy making in particular across all UK jurisdictions has highlighted 5 key tendencies which emerge and re-emerge each time a new government takes office. First of all, differentiation from the past, changing things, knifing off in the desistance literature's terms. They have to be different and they have to act. So differentiation from the past. Secondly, construction of new or revised institutional architecture. They move the furniture around, and that is either through creating new institutions or creating new rules and regulations and changing the law. They also select and nurture new audiences. That's groups to whom policy speaks. And they also have a tendency to introduce greater complexity into policy discourse. So rather than actually removing certain things, they tend to add to paradigmatic complexity. So they add new paradigms onto extant frameworks. And finally here, looping. They are constantly reinventing the wheel and bringing forth paradigms as if it was the first time anyone had ever thought of it, when it's something that had been in the system 30 years ago. So what we have in terms of statecraft is constant renewal and increased complexity. And I've added a couple more at the bottom of this. The sixth one is probably a bit tongue-in-cheek, and that's to introduce a review when they're running out of ideas or steam, and then ignore the findings, because that might be happening in England with the Taylor Review, and probably happened in Northern Ireland after its 2011 review of youth justice, and certainly happened with the parliamentary inquiry into juvenile justice in Scotland in 2004, to which I acted as a specialist advisor. And I've added a seventh. This is actually a really important one, and this is from bitter experience, which I'll go on to relate a bit later. That research evidence is utilised in the policy process only to the extent that it makes sense according to the ambition of government. Knowledge, therefore, rarely drives politics. Rather, governments select research findings which justify what they already want to do. So that limits the kind of influence we may have. Taken together, these tendencies mean that it is very difficult for research to gain traction in policy circles. And should it ever succeed, it's very unlikely that research-informed policy could ever be sustained beyond the political cycle within which it was implemented. So there are limitations on the longevity of influence. Now, as I said, these tendencies can be found across all UK jurisdictions, but I want to give you an illustration from Scotland, as the Scottish case demonstrates very starkly the ways in which particular paradigms are recycled over time, but always represented by politicians as something new and original. So, crudely put, in Scotland, there have been 3 main phases of policy over the past 30 years. This is really simplifying here. Now, the first of these is what one might term a welfarist phase, with a strong commitment to rehabilitation, parsimony in punishment, and the provisions of also the need to provide alternatives to custody. And Malcolm Rifkind, who was actually a Conservative Secretary of State for Scotland, he said this in his Kenneth Younger Memorial Lecture. Whilst the use of imprisonment may be inescapable when dealing with violent offenders and those who commit the most serious crimes, we must question the extent to which short-term sentences of imprisonment are an appropriate means of dealing with offenders. Prisons are expensive, they don't provide the ideal environment in which to teach an offender how to live a normal and law-abiding life. Perhaps some of these offenders could be dealt with by a community-based disposal without posing any undue risk to society. Now, this was an era in which the Kilbrandon philosophy in juvenile justice was in its heyday. Deeds were considered to be symptomatic of deeper-seated needs, with the children's hearing system valorising early and minimal intervention predicated on an educational model of care. So that is the first phase. Now, phase 2 began in the very early post-evolutionary period. And here, youth crime and punishment, actually, were utilised in a much more self-conscious and populist way by the newly established Scottish Government. It was a Liberal Labour coalition government at that point. And it was predicated on an exclusionary set of practices, and they tended to look south of the border to England for influence. There was a lot of borrowings from south of the border. So the commitment to welfarism was watered down. They, according to the precepts of Statecraft, they grafted on a range of new paradigms, including actuarialism, risk management, just deserts, restorative justice, all overlaid by managerialist imperatives. So lots of new paradigms grafted onto the system. Such practices now spoke to an imagined set of publics or new sets of audiences comprising what they felt were fearful and concerned citizens, victims of crime, and communities themselves, anxious and victimised communities. Policy narrative shifted away from the troubled child to the persistent offender and their failing parents. They became the objects of regulation. And in establishing the power to punish, the new administration, following the precepts of Statecraft, embarked on a massive programme of institutional construction. And I've got my favourite ever slide I've ever made here, which is intended to demonstrate the new world, the brave new world of post-evolutionary institutional construction. Everything pink on that slide is completely new. And in order to be able to demonstrate the relationships between agencies, I started putting lines on this slide, and it would have got so complicated if I continued with that I haven't put all the relationships there. It would have obscured the slide in itself. So there was this over 100 new institutions constructed, many of them with overlapping competencies grafted onto the system. Quite a lot of the transformation in the early post-evolutionary years then was either abandoned or watered down in 2007 with the onset of the SNP administration, elected on a more progressive agenda. And when Michael Matheson took office as Cabinet Secretary for Justice, he then rediscovered rehabilitation. It's so kind of him. And his speech to his Apex lecture in 2015 contains, I think, some familiar themes on youth justice. So, short-term prison sentences, claims Michael Matheson, do not work in terms of rehabilitating offenders. There's a need for robust community sentences. And the above reconsideration and reappropriation of rehabilitative ideals also went along with an emphasis on prevention and early intervention, and also a diversionary imperative within youth justice. Policy narrative was then reconfigured away from that persistent offender and failing parent of the earlier era to an at-risk child and an at-risk family. And accompanying these discursive shifts, there was again a rationalisation of architecture and actually a sort of centralisation dynamic which nobody really anticipated in the wake of devolution. So there has been overall in criminal justice policy making differentiation, grafting of new or recycled paradigms, creation of new audiences, changes to the architecture and reappropriation of earlier narratives. We're in a kind of looping cycle of criminal justice practice, and that creates difficulties for academics who are seeking to have impact. So that's the dynamics of what governments do. Let's turn now to have a little look at what institutions do and how there is a dissonance between cycles of policy at the political level and actually institutional working practices. Okay, so here we go. Well, findings from the Edinburgh study show that decision-making practices of youth justice institutions actually exhibit a high level of continuity over time, at odds with the ruptures and transformations that I've just described at the level of policy discourse. This creates a degree of institutional inertia, so they lag behind policy. And importantly, our study has evidence that these decision-making practices have damaging consequences for young people who become the objects of regulation. Now, this slide here, I'll just show you a little bit of the evidence for this. This slide shows police decision-making practices at different time points and across variant policy phases. It demonstrates that police decisions to warn or charge have been shaped by the same cultural rules over many years, including what the young person has previous form, that is being known to the police from previous years, and also low socio-economic status. So on that slide there, at age 11, during the immediate pre-devolution eras, youngsters who had previous forms had almost 8 times greater odds of being warned or charged than youngsters with no such history, even when controlling for volume and seriousness of offending. At age 15, during the more punitive term, the odds of further and warning charge for those with previous form rose to over 10, and a similar dynamic was evident at age 22 in the early years of the SNP administration. So the same kind of decision-making practices are following those young people through the life course. So institutions are thinking of them as poor and troublesome, and that label never disattaches itself from them. And that's also true in terms of convictions. A review of the key predictors of being brought to a hearing and admitting an offence, which at the time of the research constituted a conviction, or going to court and gaining a conviction, reveals that those two seem to remain fairly static over time, with early adversarial police contact and low socioeconomic status again featuring strongly in decisions. Now, these drivers of decision-making have become subsumed within institutional folkways and customary practices, taking on a self-referential dynamic, which, as I've said, belies the shifting political context. It is indeed this dynamic which has resulted in a group of young people, the usual suspects, who are recycled again and again into the system. In effect, this is criminalisation of the poor. And a very brief way in which I'm going to demonstrate the damaging impact and the criminalisation of the poor is just to look at the factors which best predict which young people end up being not in education, employment or training at age 18. In fact, the young people who end up being the most impoverished in the cohort as a whole. So one of the most damning findings, as I think shown on that slide, is that contacts with youth justice may serve to entrench poverty amongst young people and damage their life chances, and that actually by entrenching poverty, the juvenile and adult systems run the risk of reproducing the conditions in which crime becomes possible, in which violence can flourish. This table shows the results of this regression modelling, and it controlled for a range of school and family-related factors which descriptive analysis has shown were significantly related to risk of neatness. However, even when controlling for these, being subject to compulsory measures of care via the children's hearing system and having a history of referral for offending continued to be predictive of NEET status. Indeed, those with experience of compulsory measures of care had almost 4 times greater odds of being NEET at age 18 in comparison with those with no such history, and those referred by the police around 3 times greater odds of being NEET at age 18. I think that is a damaging indictment of juvenile justice as was practised at that point. So, to end this particular section of the paper, without understanding the disconnects, I think, between politicking, institutional practices and impacts on young people, the capacity of academics to influence policy will always be severely constrained, despite the multiplicity of sites and points of potential entry into discussion and debate. Indeed, funders and assessors of research need themselves to acknowledge more openly the challenges facing researchers, and in particular, they need to acknowledge the vagaries of the political cycle. They need to evolve greater appreciation of the ways in which discretionary spaces inhabited by practitioners are used and reproduced, and they need always and everywhere to hear the voice of those who are the object of regulation. Crime is a wicked problem, it is a complex problem, it requires probably clumsy solutions. But to deliver impact, we have to negotiate ourselves through a very complex environment. And this is not always properly understood by both researchers, by funders, and sometimes by academic managers. So, on that, I feel like I'm a sort of Greek chorus here, a one-woman Greek chorus about the problems of policy impact. So, a bit more positive now. My third question, what are the lessons to be drawn from the efforts of the Edinburgh study to gain traction in policy? Well, here I want to touch on what I would call the limits of social scientific inquiry, in particular to highlight the ways in which the Edinburgh study has had to reach out to other forms of creative practice, such as storytelling and drama, in an effort to engage external audiences. This has not been without some controversy and struggle, as I'll go on to explain. As I mentioned earlier, one of the key findings from our experience of external engagement is that politicians tend to draw on research evidence when it fits their own worldview and to provide a justification for what they have already decided to do. Now, during the more punitive phase of policy in Scotland, the Edinburgh study was completely shunned by government, frankly. Indeed, I have a top civil servant, a very trusted top civil servant, told me that when he attempted to bring some of our findings to the attention of a minister about the vulnerabilities of serious offending and the offender-victim nexus, the response was, "I don't care." And that was in an era of evidence-based policy making, which makes me somewhat despair. However, we have had greater impact in the more progressive SNP government years. Our findings have informed the whole system approach to youth justice, which is involving diversion, the influences, changes made to disclosure of criminal convictions of young people, and contributed to debates on raising the age of criminal prosecution in Scotland from age 8 to 12, and now the age of criminal responsibility up to age 12, although that, frankly, isn't quite high enough. Anyway, our tactics for influencing policy have been multiple, and we've spent quite a long time reflecting on what we should be doing in terms of trying to influence policy. And we had some very strong and good advice from Baroness Stern. She said we should think of policy as this fast-flowing river. And if it's a fast-flowing river with lots of craft on it and lots of debris going down that river, if you jumped into it, you'd be immediately overwhelmed, you'd be probably drowned. So what we needed to do, she said, was find the tributaries to that river, to start in those tributaries and try and generate impact in that kind of way. So we've had to adopt multiple methods, and these things include things like campaigning, actually campaigning with pressure groups and other external agencies for change on particular points of law. So we've worked closely with the Scottish Human Rights Commission, with the Scottish Children's Commissioner, with the Scottish Child Law Centre and many others. We've run multiple engagement events with local and national governments, with agencies and practitioners, young people. We've produced myriad policy briefings. And we've been very responsive to requests for data and analysis. But crucially, as I said, we've also experimented with some creative methods. And precisely because crime is a wicked problem and that external terrain is so very complex. And I'm going to give you some examples of these now. I've got 4 examples, 2 of which I want to go into a little bit of detail, but 2 of which I'm just going to rush through quite quickly. And I'm very happy to talk a bit more about them in the Q&A, but we probably haven't got a bit too much to say at this point. So the first thing that we did, creatively, was to experiment with a deep case study from the Edinburgh study data and use storytelling as a means of engagement, a means of getting people to engage with the issues raised by the case study. We created Doreen's story, and what we did with Doreen was we took her life from birth to age 24 from our data, and on a sheet of paper we drew everything that institutions knew about her, and then we drew underneath everything that we knew about her. And of course there was a major dissonance between what institutions knew and what we knew about her. So what Doreen's story shows is the ways in which people transition into care, out of care and into prison, how people transition from youth to adult criminal justice system, and how they live through variant phases of policy, the variant phases of policy I've just described, all of which have a cumulative effect, something which policy evaluation really takes into account when assessing what works. Her story also highlights the dark side of someone's life that is not known to agencies and how profound that is. And in Doreen's case, she comes to the attention of agencies as a child protection case, but the agencies completely fail to understand what the severity of her victimisation is. Subsequently, she's referred on behavioural grounds to the reporter, and she gradually morphs from being a victim to being an offender and a troublesome person in the mid-teenage years. The questions that come from her case study relate to information sharing and gathering, how effective in the long term were specific points of intervention, what could we have done differently at key moments, what were the critical moments for intervention, what's been this cumulative effect of institutional processing. There's a whole myriad of different kinds of forms of question that it is important that different sections of the criminal justice system and agencies associated with it actually sit down together and look at. So we felt that it was actually important that we got this story across, and also a feeling that we wanted to get a kind of emotional resonance, that people reacted to the story, which was actually a really terrible story. So I worked with 2 professional storytellers from the Scottish Storytelling Centre, and I gave them the timeline of Doreen, and they constructed a drama performance around it, with one acting as the narrator and the other as Doreen herself. And they constructed an imaginary dialogue between the narrator and Doreen and scripted key episodes in her life, such as the moment she was sentenced to prison for the first time, or the first time she injected heroin. And it also included reflections by Doreen on her situation, her hopes and her fears. And we had 3 acts from birth to 11, 12 to 18, 19 onwards. And when we did the engagement, we didn't tell people the end of the story. They had to actually do it in 3 different parts. They had no sense of where it was going. So we performed this drama twice. First to the Justice Leaders Network, which is a Scottish Government-led network which comprises senior members of the judiciary, the Chief Executive of Scottish Prisons, senior academics and other agencies involved in the delivery of criminal justice, including academics. And secondly, we performed it to a network of academics, practitioners at a workshop also open to members of the general public. So I would say that both of the audiences were completely gripped by the story. They found the storytelling gripping. You could have heard a pin drop in the room. But there were completely different reactions to it, as I've got up there. So the justice leaders absolutely loved it. They said the most powerful thing we've ever done with a network. It's had resonance. People are still talking about it. It animated discussion. People have been using it in terms of thinking about information sharing, about tracking cases, about decision-making practices. So it has had a lot of resonance within the policy-making community. But the reaction of some, but not all academics, was extremely negative. And I've got one particular colleague stood up and said, I hate this, and then shouted, I hate this. And that to me was a very interesting emotional reaction. And the reason for this outburst was a major concern about the ethics of what we did, the ethics of storytelling as a mode of dissemination. And she was particularly concerned that the script was reifying an account that did not exist beyond the imagination of the storyteller. So drawing data out of a much bigger data set and using this in a more qualitative way is a form of clumsy methodology. But this simply didn't fit with the worldview of that particular academic. It did not fit with her system signification. And she found the whole process deeply unsatisfactory. So that's a conundrum that we're left with about what is the value of doing that kind of thing. More briefly, Susan and I also have done, some lovely pictures here, we've also done our fringe shows. It's a part of the cabaret of dangerous ideas. And here, the idea is to take research findings out and use comedy as a way of connecting with wider publics. And interestingly, at our fringe shows, quite a high proportion of the audience is actually criminal justice practitioners. So we've got a big practitioner following in those. We called our shows Hug a Thug, or this year it was Hug More Thugs. And I can honestly tell you it's the most terrifying experience ever as an academic. So I don't know if it's something I want to encourage other people to do, but it does make you reach different audiences in different kinds of ways. And trying to talk in an amusing way about prisons and about crime is a challenge, but also a very interesting one. So that's very briefly. I'm going to be running out of time quite soon, so I'm going to be quite brief with the next two things. Just wanted to mention a little bit about the drama project that we did with the homelessness element of the transition study, about transitioning from homelessness. And in this study, again, this was a kind of clumsy methodology to engage with extremely vulnerable groups, to engage with people who have suffered deep social exclusion. And the methods we used in this element of the research lay somewhere between ethnography and action research. We had life mapping interviews with 20 participants over a year, and we constructed a drama performance around aspects of people's stories that said they would be willing to share. And we also have an ongoing photography project in this. And this drama performance was interesting because I was involved in that. And we worked with a drama artist, so it's something you can't do yourself. A drama artist used to working with vulnerable groups, and also a community education student was also on placement in the community centre at that time, and she also became involved. I've just got to show you a wee picture of that, because I ended up being in it. I didn't intend to be in the final play. But the interesting thing about that process was the amount of rich data that you can generate through an interaction over 10 weeks, 10 afternoons, about the dynamics of people's lives. In the drama workshops, what we did was we all had to act as director at certain points and direct the rest of the group in a scene from your own life. So you could position actors, you could put words into people's mouths. And it was an interesting way of exploring some of the sometimes very dark stories that people had about their pathways into that community centre and their hopes and fears for the future. We decided to call it Making the Minister Cry because we were able to put this play on at the opening of the new centre when John Swinney was going to be present, the Cabinet Secretary, Deputy First Minister at that point, and Cabinet Secretary for Finance at that point. And we wanted to, I suppose, touch his emotions too. And I wanted very much that the drama project would open up the voice of these excluded groups. And in some respects, it was fairly successful. The drama was very tiring, it was exhausting. There were a range of emotions that flowed through the sessions. People had mental health issues, and we had to be very careful at certain points that their behaviour would remain respectful. We had arguments and fallouts. It was actually a massive journey. But in the end, we put this drama on, and one of the participants stood at the front of that stage and said, in the front of 200 people, "I'm proud of myself." And that for me was a tremendously transformative moment. I feel really proud of that moment. But the challenge in this kind of research is it leads to insights for the researcher. It can lead to empowerment for an individual in that context, in that moment of the research. The challenge is to sustain those kind of moments of empowerment beyond the research moment. And very finally, just to briefly mention some work that we've been doing on design for health and well-being, doing design charrettes, working with groups of people to see if we can design a solution to certain problems around crime, designing a prison suicide cell to make it a more humane place, not just a risk-averse place, designing a city centre waste ground to enable a community to evolve, a model village project, and then finally this Hunter Square project. And this, to me, is an example of the types of projects that I think universities should be trying to evolve. It involves researchers working with students in a responsive mode to problems identified in the communities. We were approached by the police and the City Council to see if we could offer some kind of design solution to the problems of antisocial behaviour in Hunter Square. We did a lot of scoping with the local community and talked to lots of different people in the community. We designed a brief for students. The students came together for 3 days, did design, went up to the square, interviewed people. We set this up as an inclusive design project that was not about social cleansing, that it was about encouraging pro-social behaviour, and highlighted from research, actually John Bannister's research, which talks about the need for encounter with difference to ensure a tolerant society. So social cleansing is not what this was about. We came up with some solutions. We had an exhibition. We've got a meeting next month where we're going to take a composite student brief back to the City Council, and we're going to hopefully implement it. A spin-off from this has been that the researchers involved have got together and we're going to try and get a network bid to develop a programme of work on public space issues across Europe, issues about using public space. So that's an example of researchers working with students, working for the benefit and with the local community, and I think that's a really good example. So, some final conclusions then. Concluding thoughts. Well, the case study of criminology, I think, has some broader implications for social scientists in terms of knowledge construction and the impact agenda. I do think that criminology is a sort of Greek chorus for the rest of social science. We are not, as social scientists, ever neutral observers. And clean scientific knowledge is often a spurious ambition in the context of a complex and contested nature of policy engagement. We need to acknowledge that the social scientist is already a culturally imbued role. It is shaped by specific power struggles for recognition. It's shaped by our struggles for research money. It's shaped by our struggles to be published. And we must resist the potential for clientelism and knowledge patronage that some modes of engagement potentially produce. The impact agenda can have pernicious consequences. In tackling the wicked problems such as crime, we need, as a group, to be as much disruptive as ameliorative and to be reflexive about the politics of knowledge production within our own scholarly and institutional settings. So in reflecting on the purpose of universities and the way in which we as scholars should conduct ourselves, I want to leave you now with the words of Niels Christie, always prescient, who wrote this in 1971. Our role as criminologists, and I think you can substitute this as social scientists, is not first and foremost to be received as useful problem solvers, but as problem raisers, as Grint was arguing earlier. Let us admit and enjoy that our situation has a great resemblance to that of artists and men of letters. We are working on a culture of deviance and social control. Changing times create new situations and bring us to new crossroads. But equipped with our special training in scientific method and theory, it is our obligation as well as our pleasure to interrogate these problems. Together with other cultural workers, we will probably have to keep a constant fight going against being absorbed and tamed, and thereby completely socialised into society. Social scientists, I say to you, resist socialisation, resist being absorbed, resist being tamed. Thank you very much.